Hello and welcome to the third webinar of the Study in Greece Consulting webinar series From Insight to Impact. From Insight to Impact webinar series is included in the broader intelligence and consulting ecosystem of Study in Greece, comprising higher education internationalization experts from around the globe, aimed at providing Greek universities with up-to-date insight and strategic consultation to enable them make informed decisions to build a coherent, comprehensive, and focused internationalization strategy. In today's event, we are focusing on Asia and the factors and trends shaping the international student mobility in the region. Comprising some of the largest sender countries, Asia is a really promising but particularly challenging market that demands expert analysis and knowledge from those who want to navigate its complexities and leverage its opportunities. Therefore, I'm delighted to welcome a leading domain expert, Mr. Desmond Khan, Director of Global Business Development at Sinorbis. Born in Sydney, Australia, Sinorbis is a digital experience platform that is revolutionizing the way Western organizations do digital marketing in Asia. Sinorbis has been ranked by the Financial Times as one of the fastest growing companies in Australia and Asia 4 years in a row, from 2021 to 2024. Sinorbis all-in-one marketing platform has been developed with the unique needs of the Asian digital ecosystem in mind, allowing higher education institutions from around the globe to realize their full potential in the APAC region, Asia Pacific. So, Desmond, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Theo, and really happy to be here. So thank you for the Study in Greece team for putting this together. I think it's very exciting to talk about Asia and how this will be an important market going forward. Not just for why it may be an important market for universities to focus on, but we'll go into detail about why it's so difficult to do so and how you may actually be able to build a solution going forward. So I'll share my screen and prepare a slide deck for this.
Great.
Here it is. Sure, that's all visible.
Yes.
So Theo has introduced me, and thank you very much. But for those who are unfamiliar with Sinorbis or hearing about this for the first time, just very briefly, I'll explain a little bit more about what it does, because that will help explain why we know so much about this space. Sinorbis is a software that allows any Western company to be able to build and manage and operate their digital ecosystem for any market across Asia. So this may be producing web material through firewalls in places like China, or managing the messaging channels you may be leveraging across the region, like WeChat, WhatsApp, Line, all centrally managed in one place. So naturally, we work with quite a few universities around the world. We have over 100 universities leveraging our software. And so we've got a really good understanding of what channels work in what market and how to leverage those channels to actually improve recruitment outcomes and bridging that gap between marketing work and recruitment, because these are the channels in which you'd be leveraging to do that. So a lot of what I talk about today will be focused on the digital ecosystem of Asia. I'm sure we can have a whole separate session around the cultural differences and things to keep in mind when it comes to your content. But we'll talk about the technology in particular today. So just starting out, and we talk about the opportunity of Asia, like Theo said, Asia is a very important market. But it's important to understand why. It's a combination of three factors, actually. There's the size of Asia in terms of population, the economic growth, and the cultural preferences for a relatively high propensity to spend a proportion of their wealth on education. So you put all this together and you map it out, and what you see is that there is a direct correlation between the increases in growth of the outbound student market from these respective countries and in relation to their GDP growth. You can see markets like China, India, Vietnam, they're sending more students every year, but it's definitely linked to the fact that they're growing and becoming wealthier every year. So to be able to afford international education. Now, this is obviously really important. These are very populous countries. China, just by itself, has a population double the size of the European Union. India is another one of those. So, these markets are enormous. And so there's obviously a lot of students looking to study. They may not all have the places that they want in their respective home countries and would want to seek education elsewhere. But the fact that they're growing wealthier means that they can afford the extra expense that's required to pay for international student fees, accommodation, travel, lifestyle, everything in a foreign country. So it's a huge financial investment. But one thing to understand here is that, especially in markets like China and Vietnam, there's a set of values. Um, Many of them are tied to Confucian values in a cultural sense, where education is seen as a sort of pathway to prosperity. And so a large portion or a relatively large portion of one's family's income or time and energy will be spent on ensuring and securing a good education. So all of these factors together play into why these markets are important now. But the most important thing to understand here is that these markets will be the most important markets continuously for the next 10, 20 years. So what we talk about today is going to be how can you actually start engaging these markets now? And you may be thinking to yourselves, how can this improve, the next recruitment cycle or the one after that? But really, this is a generational opportunity. So, what the seeds that you plant now for the activities you do in Asia and the students that you attract and engage with, will set the foundation for your institution's ability to be relevant at all in 20 years' time when it comes to international education. And of course, the demographics across Europe and Asia look very different in 20 years, especially with plummeting student population growth in Europe. The birth rates alone dictate that we just won't be able to fill university seats in 20 years across the continent. Now, this will happen to Asia too, as the demographics change. It's just going to happen later. In the case of China, for example, the population will drastically be declined, but that won't happen until 2080, 2090. So we have several decades just by looking at the demographic numbers alone, where Asia will be an enormous source market for European institutions. And of course, this relates very much to Greece, just like it does to everyone else. Now, that's the opportunity. We have got a large market of students who can afford our education and who want to come and study here. The issue, though, is how can you actually engage those students? Now, of course, I don't just mean the fact that other countries and other institutions are wanting to compete for the same students. That's a given. When you start trying to recruit or build a brand in China or India, you're naturally going to recruit with likes of the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And those countries have started this process 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So they do have a head start. But that's not actually the challenge that you should be worried about. It's much more basic than that. It's actually how do you actually get your presence in front of the students? Because ultimately, Asia has a very fragmented digital ecosystem. There are some markets, like in China, that have a firewall whereby they can't even access your university's website legally, even if they wanted to. So we have a fundamental concern about the fact that are you even visible in the market? And then a secondary concern, are you using the right channels that the students would use to communicate with you? I can tell you right now, they're not using email. And so using email as a means of communication is very bad, not just because you won't be able to get many email addresses, but because if you start using email, the response rates are just so low because it's not used in regular everyday use. So when we talk about channels that you should be using for communication, that's very fragmented. I'll go into details of what they are. So we know that there are different profiles across the region. If we just take these examples of China, India, and Vietnam, There's a huge difference in the kinds of students that you're likely to get from each of these regions. We see that the applications coming out of India are vastly weighted towards postgraduate education and masters, doctorates, etc. Whereas for Vietnamese students, their applications tend to be more skewed towards undergrad. With China, you get more of a balance typically. But important to note that depending on your institution and the courses that you want to fill, you may actually pick a different country that's better suited. There's also from survey data, um, different qualitative concerns that each group typically have. Now, I just want to flag and say I don't want to paint each of these countries with a single brush because each of these are effectively a continent in their own right, in terms of how diverse they are and how large they are. But generally speaking, it's something to be aware of. When it comes to your messaging for markets like China, safety ends up coming back on survey data as being one of the top reasons of why a Chinese student would pick one destination over another. The same feedback doesn't come back from Indian students. What we hear from them typically on survey data again is more about costs, scholarship opportunities, and graduate outcomes. So important to understand what your institution offers, what courses you think are particularly relevant for each market, and focus on that as well before we even get into deciding what channels to use and how to promote yourselves. Just understanding is the product that you have, so to speak, the offering that you have, is that going to be relevant for your audience? So then we get into communication channels and how they vary. And I did mention this before. This is what it looks like on the map of Asia. So in a country like China, you've got channels like WeChat, Weibo, Baidu. Um, in India, you're using channels like WhatsApp, Instagram, Telegram. Vietnam uses a channel called Zalo, in addition to the Facebook systems like Facebook Messenger. Korea use a channel called Kakao Talk, and their search engine of choice is Naver, right? Not Google. So I think you're going to get the idea pretty quickly here. Japan uses a channel called Line, and they use Yahoo for their search engines. Line's also used in Taiwan. So if I just skip ahead a little bit here, you're going to get a sense, guys, that there is a very wide breadth of different channels. There's a big reason for this, because if you think about the channels we're using, Google and Facebook, that gives you access pretty much everywhere around the American continent, south and north, all of Europe, all the Middle East, and all of Africa. It's only when we get to Asia that things get very difficult because they're highly protectionist of their internet systems typically. And this is for a control of flow of information, as well as the fact that they want to promote homegrown tech industries. China is the poster child example of this because of the firewall. So you may be thinking about, infrastructure, firewalls, etc. In China, Google and Facebook IP are banned. So anything that you have that are connected to those companies just by default are illegal and don't work in China. So people in China cannot access them. But the thing to understand beyond that is that India has firewalls too. They've banned the Chinese systems. So if you use TikTok, for example, that is not accessible in India, totally banned. Vietnam nearly blocked Facebook actually, not too long ago, just a few years ago, because they wouldn't censor anti-Vietnamese government information on the platform. And so Vietnam threatened to pull the plug on Facebook in the market. So it's quite a precarious position there, a balance of, Western concepts of free speech and what the local requirements are. So there's not one channel that you can use to communicate with all countries. You have to use different systems and channels. But then, of course, there's content. Now, this comes into particular concern when it comes to markets like China, but really every country has this concern in mind. In Asia, there is a blurred line between what's political and what's cultural. And I mean, I guess you could say that's applicable everywhere. So the Chinese government, for example, would ban content that it deems disrupting social harmony. So if there's any contentious content around sensitive topics, and you can think of what those are, the content will just be banned. And it doesn't really matter what channel you're using, even if you're using WeChat, especially if you're using WeChat. So important to keep this in mind. And I'm sure as universities, this wouldn't be an issue for you in how you promote yourselves. But it's something to consider in terms of what it means to create content and use channels that are going to be effective in a particular country. They have to adhere to the local laws and customs. And like I said, often those concepts are intertwined um, about not just what they would consider morally correct, but what's legal and what's acceptable and what will be banned on the platform. So something to keep in mind there. We can obviously give you guidance on that as well if you're unsure, but something to consider. And then the final difference here when it comes to Asia is different data privacy laws. So just like Europe and in Greece, obviously you guys are all beholden to the GDPR, but there are separate competing data protection regulations in Asia. Famously, again in China with their PIPL law that they introduced in 2021. Um, just as an example, this is about how data of Chinese citizens specifically is handled, transmitted, and used. And the law has been written in a way so that it's considered extraterritorial. That is, it applies to you whether you're in China or not in China if you're handling Chinese citizens' data. So there are different then actions that you need to take to ensure that if you are taking leads or applications from China, about how you collect, how you manage and use that data to make sure you're staying compliant with the relevant laws, not just the European GDPR. Now, of course, part of the reason we built our software is to ensure that compliance with all relevant laws is adhered to. So all of our clients are compliant to these laws by default. But it's just something for you to know that this is actually a point to consider when you're setting up your digital presence abroad, especially in Asia, is that there are going to be different systems. So let's get into what some of these tools are in a little bit more detail um, to understand how they work. And I understand that in Greece in particular, going into to Asia, trying to communicate, build a brand and a profile, this hasn't been explored intensively over the last years. So a lot of this content may be new. Um, what we suggest is basically three things to set up before, like as you go into the market. The first is just to develop insights. Because, like I mentioned, this is going to help you understand which countries in Asia are going to be relevant for you and what is the audience within that country that's going to be relevant for you. Once you understand that, that will dictate all the content that you create, all the marketing campaigns that you run, any activity that you do will be tied to that concept. So, in order to find that out, obviously, there are research and reports to look at, application data, outbound student data for how, for example, Indian or Chinese students are, how, the context in which they go to other countries, or what does the data look like with past engagement with Greeks and Greek universities. I would caution when you're looking at the Greek data, keep in mind that there may be a concept of a survivor bias when looking at that data. That is, you'll be looking at information for the students, let's say, for example, China. You'll look at the Chinese students that came to the universities before a more comprehensive outreach campaign was created. So it may not tell you where the future opportunity is. It'll only tell you what worked in the past. So very useful and keep that in mind, but don't just rely on research and reports of past data because it won't show you where the new opportunity is likely to be. The other thing to consider here is speak to previous or current students from that region. Understand what's important to them. I've mentioned some insights from some survey reports that have been done in the market, but ultimately, if you've got access to these students to ask them directly, that will be a huge source of insight for you as well to know what were the decision factors involved, how did they make their decision to come study with you, and what touch points are needed along the way to make that decision. Of course, agents and third parties. I guess we're a third party in this respect. So, we could give you insights, but also let's not discount the recruitment agents that you may be using on the ground. So naturally, there may be some conflicts of interest when it comes to how information gets fed back to you. Um, but they still on the ground. They're the ones in front of students on an everyday basis. They'll have great insight to share with you about what courses may resonate with their audience and why. So something to keep in mind. And finally, any on-campus advisors that you have who have been dealing with the students and have been hearing firsthand, what their concerns or triumphs are. Um, so a great thing to sort of be across. So once you have that information, you would then, I guess, have a good idea of what countries you should be targeting and what profiles within that country. The second thing you need to do now is localize your content. And this is what I mentioned before, the basic fundamental visibility piece. So if it was China that you're wanting to be targeting, straight away, that means you need a Chinese optimized website that's going to load in China, have Chinese content so that it's searchable, and have, images and video content that's relevant for this audience. The images and videos that you use in China may not actually be applicable in India. And I don't just mean the channels that they're on, like, for example, YouTube, which will be accessible in India but not in China. I mean the content itself. Something as simple as the clothing items that some of the students may be wearing may be appropriate in one culture and not in another. So these kinds of considerations are important when you're deciding what content goes to what markets. So localizing your content here is very important. I often get asked, especially when it comes to markets like China or Vietnam, um, you know, we okay, you're telling me that we need a website in local language, but we want the international students that come to our course to speak a very high level of English because the course will be taught in English. So we need them to at least understand the website in order to understand our course material. And to that I say, sure, but there are other ways to check the English capability of a student. The reason why you need a local language content is for a few reasons. The first is searchability. When they're searching on their local search engines, like in China, they'll be using Baidu, they'll be using Chinese search terms. So the keywords that are being used, in order to map them to your website, you have to have Chinese search terms on your content. Beyond that, especially throughout Asia, the students are typically not the ones that are paying for this themselves. It's the parents or the grandparents that are funding this whole exercise. So the content that you produce should be targeted to them as well. And they don't have an English language requirement for their kid to come study with you. So making sure that the content is not just visible, but actually going to be relevant to all applicable audiences. This is why you need local language content as a priority. And then, like I talked about before, being able to communicate on the right channels. This can become a real challenge for universities because if they just want to target, for example, Vietnam, China, and India, already that's three countries. That means three separate channels to manage. So operationally, that's really hard. Again, this is kind of what our platform was designed for, is to consolidate all of these so you can have one tool to manage all of the systems. Um, but it's still a consideration to make here to know not only what channels are we going to use, but are we going to be able to service them? Do we have the right tools and infrastructure at the university so that we can handle messages, handle inquiries, and convert students appropriately? This is an important point, not just rely on email. And then the fourth thing to understand is how this integrates with the current technology stack the university may already be using. So, do you have the right systems to publish content to your audience? Like, for example, a Chinese optimized website. If you don't have the technology, can you find a tool that does? Uh, Again, I won't talk too much about this, but that is what Sinorbis can do, but important to understand. Like I mentioned before, do you have the right engagement tools to be able to communicate with on messaging apps with your audience? Do you have the right feedback mechanisms for analytics? So can you in Greece understand what's working, what isn't working at any time for any country? This is important so that not your operations aren't siloed per country, where you get asked what's happening in India, and you have to say, I don't know, I have to check with the Indian team, or I don't know, I have to check with the Chinese team, or whatever. Making sure you have visibility, control, and ownership from Greece. And then, of course, making sure that you've got the right operations in place for somebody to be able to check that and then be able to make changes and edits and updates as needed to improve your performance and monitoring it. So I've got two examples here because I guess we've been talking conceptually about what to be thinking about. Um, but we can go into a little bit more detail on the two main markets, China and India. So combined, those markets are a third of all humans on the planet. So to talk about them as like single markets is kind of misrepresenting what they are. These are like civilizational states that are going to be important for all of our economies and cultures for our lives and our children's and grandchildren's lives to come. So of course, higher education is no different to that. Um, so I'll go into detail about what those channels look like and how to engage in each of those markets. The first one being China. The main channel to talk about here, apart from Chinese websites, which we'll get into, is WeChat. And I know I've mentioned WeChat. All of you here on the call has probably heard about WeChat before, and you know it's important. But I want to articulate just how important that is in everyday Chinese life. The first thing to mention here is that WeChat has 1 billion monthly active users in China, not worldwide, in China. So double the European Union population, all WeChat users in China, effectively. So not only is it being used by everybody, so if it has 1 billion users, it means it's used across the demographic board. So all age groups, all income streams, all lifestyles using WeChat. Groups like Facebook wishes that they had a platform that could do that. But the important thing here is that WeChat's not just used by everybody, it's used all of the time. 1/3 of all mobile data traffic in China comes via the WeChat app. And that may be pretty amazing to think about. But the reason that is the case is because WeChat isn't used just for messaging. You'd have to be a lot of messages to get that. WeChat can be used for everything in China. It's used for booking hair appointments, it's used for ordering food or taxis. In fact, WeChat have gone so far as to create an environment that allows for a concept called mini programs. That is apps that can be created within WeChat. So companies can create apps for themselves in the app. It's just kind of insane. But that's how it gets used. So it gets used for fundamentally everything, payments, the works, not just messages, although of course 45 billion messages get sent uh, every day. So, you know, quite a bit here. But the connection with higher education is really fascinating. I mentioned before about understanding the link between marketing and then recruitment outcomes. There was a QS study just a few years ago that was trying to look at how WeChat articles were being read and if that influenced your student outcomes for recruitment. And what they saw is that for every increase in 100 article reads on WeChat, that is just 100 more people on average reading your articles that your university are posting on WeChat. There was a correlation to 5 international students recruited. So not just engaged, not applications, but actually recruited. So it really shows that if you are able to increase your engagement and your presence on these digital systems, the recruitment outcomes will follow. Um, if more people are engaged with the content, that means more people are inquiring. More people are inquiring, more applications, more applications, more enrollments. It's really as simple as that. But it starts with the effort you put up at the beginning to produce content that's relevant for your audience and build a profile for yourselves. So it's a really interesting stat and an important one to understand about where the potential is for how you use these systems. When it comes to India, it's a little bit different in that the main engagement tool is a channel called WhatsApp. And we all use WhatsApp But what I'm referring to here is an official WhatsApp business platform account. So it's a very different kind of account to what individually, we all may use to communicate with each other. This would be a university-owned WhatsApp account that's capable of broadcasting with templates. It's capable of having systems for automations, for responses and triaging inquiries. This is the norm in markets like India, and it's expected that you'd have a system like this to be able to field inquiries as they come. But just for some data on India's use of WhatsApp, 400 million active users as of 2021, just in India. So again, we're talking about a population larger than the EU, or about the same size, actually. It's really hard to articulate the scale that we're talking about here with these markets. But again, the survey data keeps coming back. 70% of Indian students prefer WhatsApp for communication. That is, prefer it over email. So if you want to access the Indian audience, WhatsApp is the way to go. Something as simple as open rates of your messages, they're 30% higher on WhatsApp. So without even going into detail about conversion of students into applications and beyond, they're just 30% of them read your messages on WhatsApp more than they do on email. So even just the most basic thing, are people actually reading what we're sending them? It's probably because you're using the wrong channel. The reason why WhatsApp is so popular, um, I mean, there's a lot of different factors that play there, but the simple fact of it all is that it's a low cost app to use from an individual perspective. It's free to download, and it uses very little data, which is super important in markets like India, um, where data is the sort of valuable resource to protect there. So it's a very efficient means of communication. But what I've got this slide up for here is just to go into a little bit more detail about what I was describing before about the difference between a personal account and a WhatsApp business platform account. So a WhatsApp business platform account allows you to integrate with systems like Sinorbis, where you can have automations built in. You can do broadcasting of messages to hundreds or thousands of people at a time. You'll be able to manage contacts on an individual basis and apply different segmentation to them for lead scoring or campaign tracking. So it really is a business use case for any kind of company that needs to communicate with hundreds or thousands of people at a time. Um, a normal WhatsApp business account is basically typically used for brick and mortar stores like the local hairdresser, grocer, butcher, etc. Whereas this is more for sort of larger scale operations if you need to be communicating with lots of people. So it's a huge opportunity, I guess, in summary, but it's really important to adapt your approach for each market. And again, I just want to emphasize here at the end, the key here is to get those relevant insights to understand what audience is going to resonate with your product and your offering. Making sure your content is localized for that market, in terms of your content and the channels that you're using. Communicate there using those right channels and being aware that they'll be completely different for each market, and making sure that you have the right systems behind you so that you can operationalize this. So it's not too burdensome to manage 5 channels at a time, so that you do have the right infrastructure to publish in any market, including China, or that you've got the analytics and insights behind you. So if you are curious about this, we do offer a free health check for universities. Feel free to submit that form with your details for us to be able to run that. We can tell you how long your website loads, how long it takes in China, for example, if it's accessible or not. If you are using a digital channel in Asia, we can give you a sense of how well it's working and give you some insights there on what we've seen with best practice. Happy to go into more detail on that. But of course, obviously answer everybody's questions here today as well. So one thing I want to mention is that in the platform that we have, obviously it's designed for every university to be able to use and manage their own systems. But we have worked with many other aggregate groups before and government institutions to promote themselves nationally. And what I want to offer everyone here today as well, before we get into the Q&A and go into some detail on questions that you may have, is to let you all know that with studying Greece, Sinorbis will be able to offer a group of bulk use of Sinorbis. That is one subscription for you guys to create a Chinese website, but the cost can be shared amongst all the institutions that want to take part in this. So it can be a Greek promotional tool so that you will have something accessible in China using the Sinorbis platform. But for every university, although you'll have your own pages on the website, the costs will be minimal because it'll be shared amongst the entire group. So happy to go into more detail. Theo and I can go into more detail with you guys individually about this if you're curious or want to sign up for that program. Um, but I want to just let you all know that that will be available to all members of Study in Greece going forward after this. But happy to go into the Q&A now and answer anyone's questions.
So it was fabulous, I have to say, Desmond. Thank you very much for this great cooperation. And it was a really comprehensive and detailed analysis and deep dive into the Asian digital ecosystem, which of course is impacted deeply by the broader socio-political and cultural particularities and characteristics of these countries, like in every country. So you make us realize that marketing and recruitment in Asia and more broadly needs strategic input, research, analysis, insights, and guidelines from the expert like Sinorbis. I have a first question. Could you give us some concrete examples of European organizations like Study in Greece or individual institutions that have grown their footprint in Asia, increasing their students, the number of their Asian students on their campuses, in collaboration or thanks to their collaboration with Sinorbis?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be able to send this case study around if you guys would like. We have this written up. So there's this one client in particular, and I can share the details. We had permission to share this, and we have this written up as a case study to discuss. One particular client of ours in Europe, in Denmark, who had a basic presence in Asia, um, but in China in particular, which is where they wanted to focus on, but they didn't actually realize the assets didn't work properly. So the website took over 10 seconds to load without them really knowing or being aware of it. And when we asked them about it at the beginning, said, you know, how's your website loading? And they say, well, we haven't heard any complaints. And of course, you know, that's the case because you know that there's a problem until it's too late. Um, and beyond that, the team internally were unable to get quick insights on what was working with WeChat content and how WeChat was performing as a conversion tool. So they shifted to our platform. They were able to create a website that worked in China. So they could actually now get a pathway to conversion for lead capture and beyond. And they were searchable on search engines. But also they were able to get quick feedback on how people were responding to WeChat messages. You know, what kind of questions were they getting, and then how can they change their content to better reflect the concerns of students? And with that change, they were able to increase their applications from China by 35% in the first year.
Impressive.
So it's really just something as simple as, do we communicate well with our audience or not? Are we visible from their perspective? Are we where we need to be found by them? And do we have all the right information and tools and levers to pull, just like we do for domestic work, for example? So that's exactly what the platform is designed for, is to bridge the gap. And it's very promising to see our clients have been able to get results just by simply having better tools.
How many offices, centers do you have in globally, actually? Your headquarters is in Sydney, right?
Headquarters in Sydney. I'm based in the UK. So you know, part of the group that can service Europe. We also have offices in China, of course, as well as some of our team based in France, and development work in Sri Lanka. So we do end up offering all time zones and cover all ground. So we have clients across the EU. We have about across Europe and the UK, we have about 25 universities using the platform currently. In Australia and New Zealand, where we started, about 70% of every university use us there. And we
Wow.
have about 45 universities across North America as well using us. So sort of growing this out globally from Australia where we started. And yeah, no, it's been very promising to see.
I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. No, no questions. Of course, they are covered, but you inspire us at the same time, so we can continue our productive dialogue. I'd like to ask you if you can present if there is any increase or decrease in the number of outbound students from China, India, and other Asian countries. And could you map these changes? For example, I know
Mm,
very well that India has passed China, is above China in the first center country, actually, I think, nowadays. Or correct me
mm,
if I'm wrong, or if there's a decrease to the United States, and an increase to international students from Asia to Europe. And I would also like to ask you regarding the public and private sector, public institutions and private institutions that invest in their digital marketing and recruitment in Asia. Can you say a few words about the differences uh, within the last years?
Okay. So in terms of outbound
Mhm.
versus now this is it's hard to get aggregate figures on outbound because the data comes from the host country.
Okay. Mhm.
So in order to get the total number of Chinese students that went abroad, you have to go to every single country that they went to and get the data from them and then add them together.
Mhm.
So it's much easier to get a sense per country of what the outbound from China or India looked like. That being said, um, one thing that we've seen with China, and again, this is why it's important, is the consistency. So I'll take the US as the example only because I have this data fresh in my mind. This is going to be relevant because the reasons that this dynamic is the same, it will be the same for Greece. Um, if you take China versus Nigeria,
Mhm.
so 2 years ago in the US, it was Nigeria looked like it was about to meet the same number of students coming in studying internationally as China. The following year, it plummeted. It fell by 75% from Nigeria. The reason for this was currency collapse with local Nigerian currency against the US dollar. And of course, in Greece, you guys use the euro, so the result was the same. So just fundamentally, all the Nigerian applicants could no longer afford to come and study that particular year, just due to the currency. So the interest didn't change. The courses and the demand for Nigerian students didn't change. It was literally a currency concern that basically wiped the propensity for them to come study in that year. In the same year, the Chinese students dropped by 2% year on year to China, to to the US.
Mhm.
Um, and this is amongst all of the difficult bilateral relations between the US and China. So important to understand that these markets are not only are they big, but they're consistent. And that is why it's the stability of them, which is why they become such an important staple in where these countries have recruited from. It's not just that there's demand from places like China, but there's demand for that stability and reliability of a market. Once you can actually get it working, it stays reliable. So something to keep in mind there for the outbound numbers. But versus the public and private,
Mhm.
um, we've seen a very clear mix between public and private institutions leveraging us. And what that shows is that there's a very clear dynamic that it goes both ways. Chinese students, Indian students, they're in demand, regardless of which one. What's more important as to whether it's private or public is actually things like rankings and university graduate outcomes. So, and the story that you tell, there's not much concern as to whether it's public or private from the student's perspective.
Mhm. That's true.
Um, Yeah, so something to keep in mind, if you've got good courses and you can tell a good story about what students have been able to achieve once they receive your qualification, that's really the determining factor as to whether you'll be able to be successful or not.
Mhm. And of course, besides China and India, there are other markets, countries like Nepal, Vietnam,
Mm.
Korea.
Oh yeah, Nepal has grown significantly, especially for Australia, actually. So Australia just proved that the market can be significant. No other country has tapped into Nepal in the same way. So I think there is opportunity there for other countries to do that, especially with a more price competitive offering. Um, uh, Vietnam and Thailand are surging in numbers of outbound students. They're increasing their outbound students. Uh, so I think that, yeah, there's lots of opportunity there. But like I said, you'll be competing for these students not just with the Anglosphere, the English speaking world, but with the Southeast Asian countries as well. So there's started to be a great pool for universities in Malaysia and Indonesia to recruit students from further north in Asia. So the amount of competition that's growing for these students is now obviously developing, and it's because of the recognition that those source markets are the future of higher education now and for the next 10 to 20 years. So the sooner that universities are able to start building their presence, building a brand and a profile in those markets, the better.
Mhm. And I assume that Australia focuses on these markets, especially, right?
Yeah.
Ah, very nice.
Ironically, we think of Australia as, very close to Asia and part of the Asia sphere, and that's very true. But geographically, Greece is just as close to Beijing as Sydney is. People forget that. So, yeah, there's nothing really stopping you from recruiting. Don't say it's the distance.
Yeah, that's true. I never thought about it.
Yeah, Athens to Beijing is like 12 hours. It's the same as Sydney to Beijing.
Any questions from the audience? No? They admired you, so they do not have any questions. They're all covered. Um, I would like to inform you that we have in our digital library three reports of Sinorbis. We do have the Asia Social Channels Guide, the Asia Atlas Marketing and Recruitment in Asia, and the China Digital Strategy Guide. And thank you very much for this excellent analysis and the guidelines. So thank you very much for your contribution to our internationalization endeavors. It's only the start of our cooperation, and we would like to explore this possibility and opportunity you're offering to us with this studying Greece page on your platform. And I think that it will be really fruitful. Within the years to come, we have the opportunity through our collaboration with Sinorbis, leveraging your expertise to increase the number of Asian students to Greece because there's huge potential. And Greek universities, given that Greek universities internationalize their curricula and campuses, I can see huge potential in this field, and especially regarding Asian markets. So your contribution and expertise will be invaluable. Thank you very much, Desmond. It was a great presentation. And I would like to thank our audience, of course, and looking forward to seeing you next in the next webinar in 2 weeks. So if you have to say a few words for like a closing, I don't know.
No, no, thank you so much, Thea. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with everybody. And yeah, I would just encourage you all to get in touch if you want to discuss this further about your particular institution or about the program I mentioned that we'll be running with Study in Greece. I agree. I think there's a massive opportunity here for Greek universities to put themselves on the map. It's just a matter of taking those steps and to see, on the basis of what's worked with other countries in the past.
Will you be at NAFSA in San Diego?
Yes, yes, I will be actually. Yeah,
So see you there in person.
perfect.
Thank you
Happy
very
to meet
much.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.